This is Mandela, the man and his country.
It was an announcement South Africa and the world had awaited for more than a quarter of a century.
I am now in a position to announce that Mr. Nelson Mandela will be released at the Victor Verster prison on Sunday, the 11th of February, at about 3 p.m.
The response in the streets of South Africa's cities and towns was instantaneous. Joyous and violent. 71-year-old Nelson Mandela, symbol worldwide for the oppressed of South Africa, was free, finally. 27 years a captive of the minority white South African government. 27 years the almost invisible symbol for South Africa's black nationalist movements. 27 years waiting for an end to his isolation. But now that he is free, the questions really begin. Who is Nelson Mandela? How did he become such a larger-than-life symbol? What does his freedom mean for him, for the movements he served as moral symbol and more, for South Africa, its majority of blacks, its minority of whites? Hello, I'm Morton Dean of ABC News. For much of the next hour, sit and learn about Mandela the man and Mandela the symbol, about the changing face of Africa and the bitter struggle inside South Africa that Nelson Mandela has come to represent. We'll hear from Jesse Jackson, author-historian James Michener, and South African author Rian Malan, who has written so movingly of his country's struggles. But before we can go forward, we really must go back to set the stage. Africa, at the turn of the century, a colonial preserve for the British, the French, the Germans, Italians, Belgians, and Portuguese. An imperial gold mine where the white man ruled the black man's homeland. By the end of the Second World War, the colonial map had begun to change. Slowly, spheres of influence were carved up into countries, and independence began to come. In the 50s, to Ghana, Guinea, Morocco, Tunisia, and others. At the start of the 60s, more or less in orderly fashion, the ranks of the newly independent were joined by Chad, Nigeria, Senegal, Gabon. In the main, all of it peaceful or relatively so. And then there was Kenya. Kenya, where black nationalism crystallized into violent uprising, where 11,000 would die in a vicious tribal guerrilla war for black independence. When you think of Kenya and the birth of independent black Africa, one name leaps to mind: Jomo Kenyatta, the Kikuyu warrior, leader of the Mau Mau, the first real black independence uprising in Africa. Kenyatta, the man who for 8 years would be, like Mandela was to become, a symbol behind bars. Imprisoned for terrorism, Kenyatta would lead his movement from jail, later to emerge in 1961 and ultimately become Prime Minister of an independent Kenya, the first of the African lands to fully break away, violently, from the yoke of British African colonialism. In the minds of many, Kenya was the first of the white dominoes in Africa not to fall, but to be pushed. The first in 1963, but not the last, as black nationalism swept down and across the continent. For better, and in some cases for worse, it swept away white colonial rule. Some governments were overthrown, some ceded power. What had been for decades the white man's incredibly wealthy colonial preserve began to disappear. The momentum of the black national freedom movement produced Tanzania in 1964. Tanganyika and Zanzibar were no more. The same year, British North Rhodesia disappeared as Zambia was born. British Bechuanaland was swept away in 1966 as Botswana came into existence. In 1971, the birth of Zaire, the death of the remains of the Belgian Congo. Portuguese Angola became independent Angola, followed by Mozambique in 1975. In 1980, Southern Rhodesia became independent Zimbabwe. South Africa had become isolated, the last white-ruled country on the continent, the last trench in the Black nationalist war for African independence. In 1980, Jomo Kenyatta was dead. Nelson Mandela, who replaced him as the Black nationalist symbol, had already been in jail for 17 and a half years. But his power and that of his movement were growing. To understand the symbol that Nelson Mandela has become, it's first necessary to understand Mandela the man, to understand the circumstances of his life. It was here, in the Transkei territory, that he was born, on July 18, 1918. Blacks had been forced to these territories after the ruling white government passed the Native Land Act in 1913. The act forbid black ownership of land or sharecropping or tenant farming anywhere but in these so-called African reserves. These restrictions only foreshadowed the more sweeping doctrine of apartheid to come. Mandela was born into the royalty of the Tembu tribe, and Nelson, like his father, was being groomed to become a chief. But during his education at the Methodist Mission Center in Helltown and later at Fort Hare University College, he decided to pursue a career in law. Activism came early to Nelson Mandela. Participation in a student strike resulted in him being thrown out of Fort Hare at the age of 22. But 2 years later, he did receive his degree, and 2 years after that, in 1944, he joined the African National Congress. Having moved to Johannesburg, Mandela, together with Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, founded the Congress Youth League of the ANC. In those early years, Mandela was an organizer and a leader, a believer in protest, but also in nonviolence. In 1948, the all-white National Party legalized the already pervasive system of apartheid, adopting and enforcing, among other things, laws prohibiting racially mixed marriages, laws forcing blacks to carry registration cards, laws further delineating where blacks could live and where they could not. The ANC's response was to organize strikes and call for civil disobedience. In 1952, as volunteer-in-chief of a nationwide defiance campaign, Nelson Mandela was arrested for the first time, charged under the Suppression of Communism Act. He received a suspended sentence, but he was banned. Under South African law, a banned person may not speak out, may not be quoted, may not write for publication, may be confined to certain areas, and may not meet with more than one person at a time. Mandela was banned for 6 months. But in 1953, his bans were extended for 2 years, and he was ordered to resign from the ANC. Still, he worked behind the scenes. And when the bans were lifted in 1955, he was instrumental in the adoption of a freedom charter by the ANC. It called for a non-racial state, division of land among those who work it, restoration of the national wealth to the people. Other organizations adopted the charter, and 1956 became a year of riots, boycotts, and demonstrations against the increasing stranglehold that apartheid was placing on non-whites. In December of 1956, now deputy president of the ANC, Mandela was again arrested, one of 156 activists charged with treason under the Suppression of Communism Act. The charge? Seeking to overthrow the government. The trial would drag on for 54 months. The participants, when not in court, were free on bail, and for Mandela, this meant freedom to continue the struggle. In 1960, the issue was the hated passbook blacks had to carry to move from place to place. While Mandela had already publicly burned his passbook, in that year the government extended the law to include women. Protests followed, and on March 21st, in Sharpeville, near Johannesburg, police fired into a crowd of unarmed demonstrators. 69 people were killed, nearly 200 wounded. In the chaos that followed, a state of emergency was declared, and unsanctioned political organizations were banned. The ANC was now illegal. In March of 1961, after 4.5 years of trial, Mandela was acquitted of the treason charge for lack of evidence. But within weeks, he was a fugitive, wanted this time for advocating and organizing demonstrations against the proclamation of the white supremacist Republic of South Africa in May of that year. The protests were ineffective, and there was Sharpeville. It had left a mark on Nelson Mandela. He decided nonviolence was not working for blacks, and so a paramilitary wing was added to the outlawed ANC, Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the Spear of the Nation, a change of tactics involving sabotage and attacks on economic targets of the white power structure.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
It was his last interview as a free man. Still, despite his frustration, he sounded a note of possible accommodation.
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
Avoiding arrest for almost 2 years, Mandela pressed his cause, taking military training from the Algerian army, seeking support in London from the British opposition parties. In the summer of 1962, having returned to South Africa at the age of 44, he was apprehended, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in solitary confinement. The charges: incitement to strike and leaving the country without valid travel documents. A year later, a farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg, was raided. It was the underground headquarters of the ANC. Captured were Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and other leaders of the ANC, as well as writings linking Mandela with the campaign of sabotage. The so-called Rivonia trial commanded international attention. Brought from his prison cell, Mandela conducted his own defense, setting a tone for the movement and himself in words whose echo is still being heard.
I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
After an 11-month trial, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. He was taken to Robben Island in 1964, put to hard labor, and declared a non-person. He became prisoner number 466/64. His words were not to be quoted or discussed. His photograph was not to be taken or displayed. On the mainland, the pace of protest slowed. What was left of the ANC fled the country, setting up headquarters in exile in neighboring Zambia. The government pressed its advantage, passing the Black Homelands Constitution Act, allowing for the independence of 10 tribal homelands as a way of separating blacks from the white population. Only 4 homelands accepted that independence. None was recognized outside South Africa. Black activists rejected them outright. June 1976, a student demonstration in Soweto Township sparked nationwide unrest. In the next 8 months, nearly 1,000 people died. September 1977, Steve Biko, leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, died in police custody. A month later, the government banned the country's 2 main black newspapers, outlawed at least 19 more anti-apartheid organizations, and arrested 70 of their leaders. It was a cycle of protest and repression that continued into the 80s, defying every attempt by the government to quash it, growing stronger with each attempt to contain it. But the government remained rigid. In Nelson Mandela's absence, his second wife, Winnie, whom he married in 1958, became the message carrier to the faithful. That message, too, was unchanged.
The government knows that the violence that is taking place today is in response to the violence of the fascist settler minority regime.
And through the decade of the 80s, the violence escalated. Here's how ABC News correspondents reported some of the events.
There is a lot of blood on the streets of South Africa these days. This morning, at this intersection in the black township of Uitenhage near Port Elizabeth, a funeral procession of about 3,000 blacks was stopped by the police, who then opened fire. At least 17 blacks are dead by official count and 36 wounded. The marchers, according to police, were attempting to enter a white suburb.
Gangs of blacks attacked cars and trucks, setting them afire in the townships near Durban today. They engaged police in running street battles. These men, sort of a government-sanctioned Zulu policing force, they've been called vigilantes by other blacks, moved in to take control. The trouble around Durban erupted earlier this week in apparent protest to the killing last Thursday of a civil rights lawyer.
And though he was in prison, the symbol that Nelson Mandela had become served as a rallying point. His name, a battle cry.
From the beginning, early this morning, South African police were determined there'd be no demonstrations of any kind in Cape Town today. They sealed off the rallying point for a major march planned in support of jailed dissident Nelson Mandela. Viva Mandela! Viva! Whether it was because of the repeated police warnings or yesterday's arrest of apartheid activist Dr. Alan Bosak, only a few hundred people showed up for the march he organized, far fewer than the thousands he predicted. Still, police would have none of it, and they charged into the crowd, whips flying. Time after time, the police attacked as the crowd dispersed, then regrouped.
Between January of 1984 and July of 1986, more than 2,000 were killed. In late 1985, President Botha was desperate enough to try and cut a deal. Nelson Mandela had been moved to Pollsmoor Prison near Cape Town in 1982. Senior government officials were rumored to be visiting him in secret. To Botha, the time must have seemed right.
If Mr. Mandela gives a commitment that he will not make himself guilty of planning, instigating or committing acts of violence for the furtherance of political objectives, I will in principle be prepared to consider his release.
Although technically still a non-person, Mandela's reply was carried by his family to the people. President Botha had underestimated Nelson Mandela.
My father says, I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated.
The violence continued. Played out on the world's television screens, international reaction was finally galvanized. The United States, against the wishes of President Reagan, joined in the imposition of sanctions.
We simply have to make a statement about apartheid and our opposition to it.
While rejecting a total trade embargo with South Africa, which the House has passed, the committee's bill does have economic teeth. Among the sanctions approved by the committee are these: a ban on investments by U.S. companies doing business in South Africa if they discriminate against black workers, an embargo on the importation of South African uranium and coal, a ban on the use of U.S. banks by the government in Pretoria, and denial of U.S. landing rights to South African airlines. The committee's bill also says these sanctions will stay in place until the South African government takes certain steps, including the release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners.
Estimates are that the combined world sanctions from 1985 to 89 cost South Africa between $32 and $40 billion. The cost in prestige, many felt, was higher. South Africa was now inextricably in the world spotlight.
From America, the widow of Martin Luther King came to offer support to another black leader's wife, effectively widowed by a system.
Mrs. Mandela is a great symbol of strength.
She is a symbol of what my people continue sacrificing for.
The world picked up Mandela's song and Black South Africa's cause.
Free, free, South Africa.
The continued pressure began to take its toll, and the first cracks in the system appeared. Meetings that had been secret could now be discussed publicly.
State-run South African TV made the announcement tonight about the surprise meeting between President Botha and Nelson Mandela.
They didn't negotiate, and there was no discussion of policy matters. The state president and Mr. Mandela took the opportunity, however, to confirm their support for peaceful development in South Africa.
While no pictures of Wednesday's meeting at the president's compound in Cape Town have been released, the government says Mandela paid what it called a courtesy visit. The lawyer for the jail leader says the talks were long overdue.
The rest of the world considers him to be the most important South African, but the South African government has never taken that view. Not until today, anyway.
In December of 1988, after being treated for tuberculosis at the age of 70, Mandela was moved here to the Victor Verster prison farm. The move only seemed to confirm the signals of change. To be sure, there were and are those to whom change is an unacceptable concept.
We, as the white people in South Africa, want a white state in South Africa where we can rule ourselves.
But change is sometimes unstoppable. And on February 2nd, 1990, Willem de Klerk, the new South African president, addressed the nation.
It is time for us to break out of the cycle of violence and to break through to peace and reconciliation. The prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded. I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally.
After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela would be free. 9 days later, he was, and the flow of memorable images began.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. A salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see.
It's probably the best thing that could have happened in the political situation in South Africa for a long time.
It means freedom to me.
It's about time this country changed and came out of the dark ages.
I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom for all. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. I reiterate our call for, inter alia, the immediate ending of the state of emergency and the freeing of all and not only some political prisoners.
I'm absolutely excited to be out. The armed struggle is merely defensive. It's a defensive act against the violence of apartheid. But we remain committed to peace.
Mandela way to Somla, Mandela way to Somla, Mandela way to Somla, Mandela way to Somla. No mercy, no trust, no mercy, no trust.
Let each one of you and all of our people give the enemies of peace and liberty no space to take us back to the dark hell of apartheid.
This is the time.
So there he is, Mandela, the free man, no longer just a series of still pictures and fragments from decades-old speeches. He is a man with a plan for his country and his people. He's a man now out of prison with whom his allies and enemies must deal. And to do that, they have to answer some very basic questions. How did he become such a symbol? And now that he's free, is that symbol likely to change? Those are questions we put to four people who know South Africa and South Africans very well. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, James Michener, who began studying South Africa in the 1960s for his novel The Covenant, Randall Robinson of Trans-Africa, and South African journalist Rian Milan, author of the recently published My Traitor's Heart. First question, the meaning of Nelson Mandela, the man and the symbol.
Traditionally, we've been taught, governments encouraged us to look upon him as some sort of communist terrorist demon. And I think that there's still whites in the country who look at him that way. But for the bulk of us, he's become a sort of living mirror in which we see a rather cruel reflection of ourselves. And it's by his unshakable adherence to the principles he believes in, and by his unwillingness to accept freedom on the conditions set by whites in spite of 28 years behind bars, he's caused an awful lot of us to have a very, very good look at what has been going on inside our hearts and minds. And I think that there are many of us who have reached, well, conclusions that would have been unthinkable 10 years or so ago. I saw an Afrikaans journalist on television last night who said that what we need in South Africa is a Moses to lead us out of the wasteland in which we're in. And at the moment, the only Moses on the horizon in South Africa is Nelson Mandela.
He is the classic suffering servant. And while suffering in jail as a political prisoner in the context of apartheid, this extremely repressive system, he emerges as the one who has articulated the new and the free and the democratic South Africa. So on the one hand, he represents the highest of our democratic ideals. On the other hand, he represents the classic oppressed person in the racist system. The second thing is that Mandela has developed a mystique and a moral authority. He is a man sitting in jail without the right to vote, without a dollar, without a bullet, without a standing army, and is negotiating. He may be the freest man in all of South Africa because of the sheer weight of his moral authority and believability.
Well, when some 25 million black people are being discriminated against in every respect in their homeland, a homeland which I grant they share with whites who also have it as their homeland, the blacks will search through all of their personalities to find some woman or some man who symbolizes the fight that they're engaged in and the ambitions which motivate them. I think that in choosing Mandela 28 years ago as their leading symbol, they chose very wisely. They picked a man who was going to suffer imprisonment with dignity, a man who spoke well, a man handsome in physical appearance with a good voice, a man whose track record was impeccable, and whose behavior, which put him in jail, was not offensive by international standards. He was sort of like Tom Paine in the United States, or more like Otis, maybe Sam Adams in New England. He was a world revolutionary within the good definition of that term. When they picked Mandela, they picked a prime winner. And he has won the affection of not only blacks, but of whites throughout the world. And what's especially interesting, he won the affection of a lot of blacks, of a lot of whites in South Africa, who knew that if they didn't get him, they were going to get somebody infinitely worse.
Oh, he is the embodiment of the freedom struggle in South Africa. He, to honor Nelson, really, Nelson Mandela, for us here, black Americans, and people throughout Africa and the Caribbean, or people anywhere in the world who've struggled against injustice, is to honor the very best in all of ourselves. He is a splendid measure of what we should strive to be. Regal, strong, bright, principled, unwavering, all of those things. And on Sunday, when he emerged from prison after 27 years, the sight was so remarkable because there's no visible diminution of any of the things I spoke about. An extraordinary capacity to endure and to emerge unbroken.
Well, believe me, the Mandela who went into prison was a very strong man. The Mandela who came out and spoke to us yesterday over television is an even more powerful man. I was not only shocked to see him, I was delighted to see him in such good form. To hear his voice so strong, to hear his logic so impeccable, and to hear everything that he said almost right on target. We don't want a great physical confrontation. We want to work with the whites. We're not going to surrender on our basic demands that this be a multiracial nation. I thought his performance was superb. He reminded me somewhat of one of Lincoln's inaugural addresses, where he said, "Let's bind up the wounds and get on with life." You put a very good man into jail, but you also got a very good man out of jail. And I think South Africa should rejoice that a man as good as that was the one they got back.
Well, it's clearly a watershed in South African politics. I could say for the last 40 years, but perhaps even for the last 3 centuries, the ruling Afrikaners have believed that they would always have it their own way. And to the extent that they've been willing to deal with black leaders, it's been with black leaders of their own creation, men who are prepared to work within apartheid structures, and essentially operates on white terms, on terms set by white people. The unbanning of the ANC and of the PAC and Mandela's release, for the first time, signals Afrikaners' realization that they're going to have to deal with what the left and the opposition in South Africa calls real black leaders, and Mandela certainly is that. So in that respect, his release is remarkably significant, yes. I think it heralds the first move towards the normalization of South African politics. I doubt that it's an end in itself. I think it's the start of something, of a long and probably painful process of negotiation that might be punctuated by violence.
It'll be a tidal wave. For those who are prepared for a new South Africa, they'll ride the surf, as they are doing in Eastern Europe. For those who are not prepared, they'll be drowned. We hope that people can ride the surf to a democratic order, to relieve whites of the fears they've been taught to harbor. Whites here, guns have been sold tenfold since the clerk's speech last week. They've been taught the big lie that blacks were inferior and destructive and would hurt them. Lies lead to fear, fear to hatred, hatred to violence, and violence to conquest. And so whites must be relieved of those fears, and blacks of their pain and oppression. For a new South Africa, there will be cultural expansion as opposed to isolation, diplomatic connections as opposed to severance, and economic growth and expansion as opposed to the stifling that's taking place now with the sanctions from around the world.
I think what good flows from it is the momentum towards the inevitable result of democratic South Africa. The question is how great a price must be paid during the passage in bloodshed and time and opportunity lost. I think his release and his unwavering commitment, his high ground message adds to our optimism that the distance can be traveled with not ease, but less difficulty than might have been there. The troublesome part of anything of this kind is that anytime a human being is described as a mythic figure, it is virtually impossible for any mortal to meet those expectations. He can't be expected to control the behavior of millions and millions of people, black and white. Considerable influence that he has notwithstanding, I think that's too much to expect of any man. And I think therein you find the risk.
As for those risks, can Mandela draw lessons from the past or from the present to help him through the uncertain times ahead? Who are Nelson Mandela's heroes and his role models? Is there a connection with Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, a beacon for all of black Africa in the 1960s?
Well, in a sense, yes, but Nelson Mandela comes out of a completely different ideological tradition. Jomo Kenyatta was an Africanist who believed in Africa for the Africans. And his struggle was essentially anti-colonial. It was against the British. South Africa is somewhat different. The Afrikaners themselves have always had an anti-colonial frame of mind. And their opposition has, at least in the course of the last 30 years, has grown out of a socialist tradition where socialism has been seen as the grail towards which the liberation movements aspire, the answer to the problems that beset black South Africa, to black unemployment, hunger, misery, land hunger, and so forth. And Nelson Mandela is firmly in that tradition. But then there are similarities. I read an account the other day of Jomo Kenyatta's coming to power and his first address to white Kenyans, who had also been taught to regard him as the devil incarnate or a diabolical figure. And in his first address to them, they were expecting to be told to pack their bags and get out of his country now that he'd come to power. Instead, he said, "Please, stay. We need you here. We need you to work with us." And I think Nelson Mandela, before he went to prison, and in his recent utterances from signals from behind bars, is united with Kenyatta, and at least in that respect. He seems to be willing and determined, in fact, to achieve some sort of reconciliation with whites.
In a sense, Nelson Mandela's place in history will not be determined by the present, but by the future of South Africa, a future which the 71-year-old Mandela may now be able to help guide. What, finally, is the legacy of Nelson Mandela?
There's a line from the ANC's magazine Sechaba that seemed to sum it up. The magazine said, "This is a struggle in which there's no middle ground of either political or moral nature." That was in 1987. Things have changed enormously in South Africa since then, partly as a result of what Mr. Mandela himself has been doing from behind prison walls. In the course of the past year, the authorities have allowed him to see a string of black leaders. And they've all come out preaching peace, talking about tolerance and discipline and reconciliation. He's attempting to heal the breaches within the black community and within the rivals and his black rivals for the power struggle. And he seems to have had an enormous effect on the hearts and minds of the white men who've been negotiating with him. They come out of his prison cell talking of him as an immensely honorable man, a man that they respect, and a man with whom they can deal. And so, in a sense, he seems to have begun a process of transforming South African politics from a realm in which the rule is mutual intolerance into one where it looks as though we might actually be able to find common ground.
I don't think there will be disappointment in him. I think there will be an understanding of certain almost immutable realities. That's life. Also, I think with that understanding, should that happen, and it doesn't have to, will be an appreciation of a lost opportunity. And that's why I think things have to be put on a fast track. You can't whittle away at the goodwill and the momentum. You have to go, people of goodwill have to take this on both sides, white and black, have to take it the distance as quickly as we can get on with negotiations to achieve the kind of society we all would like to see.
All of this really brings us to the future, with Nelson Mandela now free, turned, as one journalist noted, from legend to mere man. The questions just now begin. How will he cope with the power he so clearly has? Will the transition he demands for South Africa come easily and peacefully or not? And will Nelson Mandela, free, be able to lead as effectively as he did during those 27 years behind the bars of South African prisons? The questions will remain, and so will the images from the 4 dynamic days when Mandela was squarely back in the world spotlight. Perhaps the most moving when he joined more than 100,000 in a Soweto soccer stadium to sing the ANC anthem, at once mournful and so very hopeful. I'm Morton Dean, and this has been Mandela, the Man and His Country.
This has been a special production of ABC News.